All right. Linda W says, should I be adding salt to my dog's homemade diet? Ooh, such a good question. Linda, that depends on the recipe that you're making. So for instance, I made a recipe for a client last week, and the base of it was seafood. This particular dog that I was formulating for had an allergy to beef and chicken. So I made her a salmon diet. And I also had some kelp in there and some dulse and some sea vegetables. Seafoods are naturally high in iodine and salt. And so I didn't have to add any salt. When I put all of that recipe into my animal diet formulator, I didn't need to add salt because all of the foods in her nutritionally complete homemade meal had a lot of salt. However, when I do make homemade recipes for pet parents, let's say a chicken-based recipe or a beef-based recipe, I do have to add salt most of the time, unless I'm using a supplement that contains adequate sodium chloride. It is important that you are following a recipe. And so if you're guessing at a homemade diet, I would tell you, you can guess if you're feeding your dog 14 meals a week. If you want to guess at 2 of those meals, just throw together whatever leftovers, totally cool. But what I don't want you to do is to guess the majority of time, because what that means is you're probably deficient on not just sodium chloride, salt, but iodine, vitamin E, zinc, magnesium, manganese, some of these really important nutrients that your animals need. And they're really hard to come by. You know, the richest source of zinc that you could find in the wild are testicles and teeth. Gross. No one's going to feed those, right? But then my question to people say, oh, I just guessed at my recipe. I'm like, well, how are you supplying zinc? And people say, I don't know. How am I supplying zinc? And what I say is you're probably not. The downside about multivitamins for dogs and cats is that none of them, and I mean none of them meet minimum nutrient requirements for vitamins and minerals. So you won't be able to give a multivitamin and feel covered. So just make sure you're following recipe. If your recipe calls for salt, I want you to use it, Linda. I do get that question a lot. In fact, my client last week said to me, oh my gosh, why isn't there salt in this diet? All the other recipes you've made for me had salt. And I was so proud of my client. I said, that's so cool that you recognize that. This diet is seafood based and it naturally has more sodium. So we didn't have to add it, but I thought it was cool that she knew enough that she should ask that question. So you should be adding salt, Linda. If the recipe calls for salt, you need to be adding it. And if you don't add it in, interestingly, your animals can become sodium deficient. Dogs and cats' evolutionary diet contain a lot of blood, and blood has a lot of salt. So people say, I think it's weird that there's salt in your diets. Sodium and chloride are necessary minerals. So if your recipe calls for it, add it in. Crystal E says, can cats eat bone broth? Yes, Crystal. And it'd be awesome if you would make your kitty bone broth. You could also buy bone broth. If you buy bone broth, make sure you flip over and read the ingredients, no onions. But kitties do really well with bone broth. And I have found, especially older kitties, it's soul food for them. It's also a great way if you have a dry food addicted cat, adding bone broth, especially warm bone broth into dry food is a great way to add additional moisture to help decrease kidney stress over time. All right. Sarah F says, is there an alternative to omega-3s that are not fish-based? Okay, well, this kind of ties into seafood. Some animals have mammal allergies. Some animals have bird allergies. Some animals have seafood allergies. If your animal has a seafood allergy, that makes it, I'm so proud of you, Sarah, for recognizing that animals need omega-3s. Bark and Whiskers family, when you hear that term omega-3, I want you to be thinking DHA and EPA. Omega-3 fatty acids for dogs and cats really in your brain need to be only be thinking DHA and EPA. The vegetable sources of omega-3s that humans sometimes claim, like flaxseed and chia seed, dogs and cats can benefit from the vegetable sources of omega-3s, those short-chain veggie omega-3s, because they supply ALA, alpha-linolenic acid. But what they don't supply is any DHA and EPA, because dogs and cats lack the enzyme that convert the vegetable sources of omega-3s to DHA and EPA. They can't do it. So what I don't want you all to think is that by supplying hemp seed, chia seed, any of those veggie oils, camelina oil, what are some other popular ones? I think hemp and chia are flaxseed. People are like, oh, I give my animals flaxseed for omega-3s. That doesn't do anything for DHA or EPA. So just recognize that. I can tell Sarah that you know that. And I love that you asked that question. Thank goodness there is actually a vegan non-ocean source of omega-3s. It's called algal oil, and it comes from algae. Now, it doesn't usually supply a lot of EPA. Most algae-derived omega-3s are high in DHA, but not a whole lot of EPA. But those are coming. In fact, I am working with a Canadian company right now that is developing a high EPA and DHA strain of algae. So right now, the best you can do is look, you have to go to Human Health Food Store. I don't know of any animal algal products on the market yet, but if you yourself or any of your animals are seafood sensitive, or you yourself are vegan, vegetarian, and you don't consume anything from the ocean, I think it's really important that you are supplying yourselves and your dogs and cats algal oil, because it's the best we can do. And animals have such a high requirement for DHA and EPA that it's really great that you recognize you should be supplying it. You always supply DHA and EPA, or those omega-3 oils, at the time of feeding. Omega-3 oils are very sensitive to heat, light, and storage. So they need to be added right before your animal eats them. If you want to put them in a homemade diet and then freeze it, there is some loss during freezing, but it's minimal for the first 3 weeks. That's why I say if you're going to feed frozen foods, you want to use up the foods that's been in your freezer in about a month, because after a month, the DHA and EPA can begin to drop. So I do like really supplying it at the time of feeding. If you feed any commercially available foods, there's definitely not enough EPA and DHA in the food. You'll also, if you followed me for a while, know that I'm a big fan of feeding sardines. And sardines supply, they're small fish. They tend to not bioaccumulate marine-based toxins. Dogs and cats usually love them. Little, easy, simple. Put them on a lick mat, put them on your food topper. But that's a food-based source of supplying DHA and EPA that is delicious and wonderful. And that's what I do for both Callie and Homer. If you don't have a source of sardines, or your animals hate fish, or you don't want to feed that fish protein, you just want to give the DHA and EPA, you want to give the oil but not the protein, then you could use third-party tested krill oil, squid oil, or if you have a seafood allergy, algal oil. But good for you for recognizing that you want to add in DHA and EPA.